I'm used to it, in conferences that we prepare a paper and you have it. And I'm worried you don't have it. And so the tradition for me has been just to highlight some of the points in my paper. But I'll try and make it, my message as clear to you as possible. I have really 5 headings, first of all. Oh, like this, okay. I'm hoping that you'll get there. Alessandro did tell me I have the most difficult job of all because I'm going to talk about religion and people not interested in religion. And Nancy said to me, you only have 20 minutes, and I'm used to talking for at least an hour in universities. Lectures are an hour, so I only have 20 minutes. And then she said to me, and you have to speak slowly. Even more difficult for me. I really wanted to make 5 basic points in my paper. I want to talk a little bit about background. I want to talk a little bit about finitude, a religious point, the focus of what I think religious education should be. Thirdly, I want to talk a little bit about character education. And lastly, I want to give you a word of encouragement as regards religious education. Let me just talk a little bit about the background. I'm perhaps part of the scene of globalization because I'm Dutch by birth, brought up in Canada, living and working in Scotland and then in England. I live and work in Birmingham of the United Kingdom, which is a very plural city. Something like the ethnic minorities in Britain form the majority of the population in Birmingham. So we're talking about a very, very diverse city. It has a large Muslim population, something like 20%. It has large groups of Hindus and Sikhs. So when we are required, as we are in Britain, to deliver religious education in school, there's a very significant challenge. What do we do? The story starts really with 1944, when the British government passed the Education Act, the 1944 Education Act, which requires the teaching of religious education in school and to have a daily act of worship in school every day. And for 44 years, that was the only requirement on schools. Schools weren't told what to teach. They were free to teach whatever they thought was necessary to teach. But the one thing they did have to do was to teach religious education. And the question is, what? This had become, at least as far as Birmingham was concerned, in the 1950, our religious education syllabuses are determined locally. And in Birmingham, the 1950 syllabus talked about teaching the best values to children that Christianity had to offer. So it was very clearly about values, developing the values of children. The question is, of course, what values? But as time developed, the global picture, we're now much more aware of the diversity of religious life and practices across the world, partly because of tourism, partly because of the internet, but more importantly because of immigration. As I've indicated, Birmingham is very plural. So what do we do? The first reaction in Birmingham was to develop what was called a multi-faith syllabus. The teaching of all the major religions was prescribed. And in 2004, the religious education community said we must teach Christianity and the 5 other major religions, Buddhism, Islam, Hinduism, Judaism, Sikhism. And then they added, and 3 minor religious traditions, they mentioned Zoroastrianism, Baha'is, Jains, and then they said, and you must also teach secular philosophies. And of course you must do this in 40 hours a year, if that, depending on your head teacher. Because some head teachers say, oh no, I can only give you 20 hours, or maybe hardly any at all. So, and they added in this document, this guidance, national guidance on what to teach, you must do this in depth, right? So, this is why my first point is finitude. We are finite beings. The first temptation in the book of Genesis, if you know your Bible story, is to become like God. We are not God. We don't have infinite time. We have finite time. So you must learn to decide what it is that you want to teach, why it is that you're teaching. You can't teach this agenda. Many of the teachers in Britain feel disempowered. They don't know enough about the subjects, or enough to teach you with any enthusiasm. They're secularized, like many of the people here probably are. So they want to know, what do I teach if I'm compelled to teach this? And the answer is, well, sometimes they teach not at all, or they teach it very badly. And my agenda is partly to try and show what is worth doing. There's a system in Britain which comes something like this, that the syllabus for religious education has to be agreed. And it's agreed between politicians locally, teachers, the teaching profession, the Church of England, because it's the established church, and other faiths and other communities. And they have to decide, what do we do? And in Birmingham, I had some role in this. I said that the goal is not to teach religions. The goal is to think what religion is about. The focus of religion is, what do we live for and live by? Religious traditions are a resource. Traditions are what we hand on of things that matter to us. They are a resource to help you to see what it is worth living for and living by, and discussing that. And different religious traditions have something to contribute to that. Of course, you will draw on the things that you know locally, that you've experienced locally in your own culture, but you can see that there are other people who have something to contribute as well. My main criticism of the agenda that was set by the National Guidance for Religious Education was that it provided a secular study of religious education of irreligious, because it fails to recognize what religions are about. So I'd want to emphasize, remember that religions are about what it is we should live for and live by, what values we need to incorporate. So, what do we have a choice? Do we choose between the secular study of religion, or do we focus on what religious life might be about? My objections to the secular study of religion is that partly it is not how religions understand themselves. It tends to distance the pupil from life, to become observers. It's a bit like going to the zoo and seeing lots of different species to which, of course, you don't belong. You're not in that. You're not in the cage. You're standing out simply looking. And that itself is something that religious life will not allow you to do. It tries to remind you, you are alive. You live. You exist. What do you exist for? Why do you do what you do? Think about these things. So the secular study of religion, the academic study of religion, teaches you to become an observer. Whereas in life, in fact, in life you are an actor. You have to choose what to do. And you have to think about what it is that commands you. So objective has been to try and say, look, the essence of religion is not to teach systems or beliefs, but to select material that religions have to offer, which encourage you to examine your values, to understand yourself, because religions provide an overarching picture of meaning for human life. Now, this has meant that in Birmingham, and this came with the agreement of all the religious leaders in Birmingham, that we should be looking at developing the dispositions of children, their values, and to see what it is in religious life that we have to offer there. When we're looking at values, and this is really one of my criticisms of much schooling, is to think that people are only brains, and we have to provide them with information. Children are not brains. Children are persons, and they have feelings, and they have a will. They decide what to do and how to do things. I used to explain this to teachers in this way. Look, we have a terrible situation in Syria at the moment. You can teach children the facts of the conflict. But if in the process of learning all the information, they feel no pity, you have failed. They need to feel what is happening to human beings there. But if they have information and they feel and do nothing, you've also failed. You must exercise their will to act and to do. So in religious life, we think of human beings as more complex than just gathering information. You try to motivate people. You try to encourage people. You try to console people with the facts of life to help them to live and to make their way meaningfully in life. So we talk about developing not only their cognitive abilities, their ability to think, but also their ability to feel certain things and to think about things that might stimulate their feelings, and to recognize their feelings, to become aware of their feelings, and to deal with them in a constructive way. But also to develop their will to act, to practice things. I mean, we heard this discussion this morning about Cambodia, about doing things, learning through doing. And effectively, that's what religious life has also been telling us for years, although we sort of mix up the picture by talking about doctrines. No, in my paper I mentioned the biblical text, Matthew 25, which talks about the last judgment, the only judgment that counts. What in the last analysis are we about as human beings? And the answer given there was, did you feed the hungry? Did you clothe the naked? And so on. That's what matters, is what you did, not what. You're not required to do a theology exam in the last judgment. It's important to remember that. It's what you've done in your life and with your life that matters. And religion constantly reminds you about that, because it is what you practice that matters. Of course, there's also the sense of community life. We do not exist in isolation. We exist with others. And it's the communal life and how we share and express what we are about that also matters. So we'll talk about, in the religious education, we want to communicate not only information but feelings and motivate them to develop their community, sense of community, to think about how we express that together. Now, in Birmingham, I talked about developing dispositions through religious education. And I talked about 24. But of course, if in Western culture, we talked about the cardinal virtues, developing wisdom, justice, courage, temperance, at least, and think of what these traditional values might entail. On the way here, I was reading Plato's dialogue, the Leitchis, and it's about bravery. And how do we communicate bravery? How do we educate children to be brave? To be resilient is a common term now they use in Britain. And the question is, the answer that comes out very clearly in this dialogue, although, you know, most of Platonic dialogues end in what is called aporia, that's to say no definite conclusion, because they want you. Plato wants you to make the decision, the student to make the decision, the reader to make the decision. But basically he wants to convey that you don't only need to feel things and do things, but you need to do so with a bit of knowledge, with a bit of understanding. So bravery isn't just about feeling and doing, it's also doing things wisely, with understanding, to know the consequences of what you're doing, as well as the intentions and motivations by which and for which you do things. Of course, other religious traditions, this is the lesson we've learned in Birmingham, other religious traditions can make a big contribution. You see, if in Christianity one might teach the parable of the Good Samaritan, who is our neighbor? And our neighbor is whoever is in need. You may teach that parable and encourage young people to think along those lines and to act like that as an example. But it's enormously helpful to know that, for example, the Sikhs, at every Sikh temple or gurdwara, there's a langar, a kitchen, where they provide free vegetarian food. Anybody can come off the streets and get fed. And Sikhs think of the privilege and to be able to provide that service to the hungry and the poor and the needy. It's important to remember that other religious traditions have an input in how we care for others. Muslims, which sometimes seen in the British press certainly as creating huge problems. Muslims are committed to zakat, the third pillar of Islam. That's to say they have to provide a certain proportion of their income for those who are in need. It is important to remember that we are in this situation, that other religious traditions can make an enormous contribution to our understanding of what we should live for and live by. And getting that interreligious discussion going in school as well as in the wider community is important. Religious education in Britain is governed by law and fits in with the overarching aim of education in Britain, which is the goal of education generally is to develop the spiritual, moral, social, and cultural development of pupils and of society. I don't know what your schools do to develop the spiritual, moral, social, and cultural life of society, but you certainly have a responsibility for schools, for the children in your school. And you need to think about what that spiritual and moral contribution can be and what our past traditions can offer in that respect. So thank you very much.